sometimes the only way to shape a better future is to learn from the past. In 1945, as the Second World War ground to a close, humanity faced an existential threat even greater than the fight against fascism. Despite all the bloodshed, the global population had more than doubled over the previous 150 years. Scientists predicted that over the next century it would rise by much, much more, from 2.5 billion to over 9 billion. There wouldn't be enough land to grow the food required to feed us all. Mass starvation seemed inevitable. But those scientists hadn't factored Norman Borlaug into their equations. The American botanist arrived in Mexico in 1944, hoping to breed more productive types of wheat. He was shocked by the poverty and the hunger of the people. "I don't know what to do," he wrote to his wife, "but we have to do something." Borlaug spent years in the heat-blasted fields, painstakingly tweezering off individual stamen and mingling pollens by hand. The locals thought he was crazy, but his bloody-mindedness paid off. After many years, he managed to create a high-yielding, disease-resistant wheat. Mexico flourished. Scientists repeated the trick for rice and corn, and a new style of intensive farming spread across the world, combining tough breeds of crop with industrial fertilizers, pesticides and herbicides, and improved irrigation. Productivity soared. Billions of lives were saved, but solving one problem often creates others. As these crops became more abundant, we ate more of them. It became easier to manufacture and market cheap products full of the sugar, fat and salt that humans find hard to resist, even when they make us ill. 3 in 10 adults in this country are now obese. Bad diets killed 15% of us. The current pandemic has revealed quite how dangerous the modern diet is. People suffering from obesity are almost 50% more likely to die from COVID-19. And it isn't just our health at stake. As the amount of food being produced from the land increased, wildlife has decreased. In the UK, we have lost half our farmland birds, 97% of our wildflower meadows, and half our ancient woodland. The food sector is also responsible for 20 to 30% of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. Our food system needs another revolution. The job of the National Food Strategy is to work with citizens to figure out how. This is your chance to help shape a better future. As we emerge from the COVID-19 crisis, how can we build a more resilient and less harmful food system? How concerned are you about where your food comes from and how it is produced? How much are you prepared to change your own eating habits, to improve your health and to protect the environment? What should food companies and governments do to help us make the right choices? How do we make sure everyone can eat well, even in the coming economic crisis? Now is the time to make your voice heard. Help build a food system fit for the next generation.
So that is the scale of the problem. How do we fix it? A very good afternoon and welcome to our studios in London. My name is Sarah Mukherjee. I'm Chief Executive of the Institute for Environmental Management and Assessment and a member of the National Food Strategy Advisory Panel. And I'm absolutely delighted to be with you here for the next 90 minutes, where we will be in conversation with Henry Dimbleby, the author of the National Food Strategy. We'll be taking your questions and hearing from you about what you think about his bold ambition to fix our soils, to fix our systems and to fix ourselves. So in a moment, we'll be hearing more from Henry about his solution to the problems posed in that video. But first, a quick reminder that we will be hearing from you via the Slido app. You should have all the details in your packs that were sent to you before this event. But if not, go to slido.com, scan the QR code and answer the questions. And just to test the technology, yes, always a dangerous thing in a live event, but let's see if it works. We're going to ask you a question now, and it's very simple. What sector are you from? And we'll get the results in a minute. Agriculture sector, academia, civil service. Very interesting. That's fantastic. We'll leave it up for a few more seconds. Does that surprise you, Henry?
I think it looks to me like it's stuck. Oh, there we go. There we go.
Excellent.
No, it's fantastic to have so many farmers here. Look, here we go.
Yes.
It's coming in.
Oh, NGOs are coming on the home straight. That's fantastic. It is. It never ceases to amaze me how quickly you can do this. People from all over the country and all over the world are dialing in as we speak. and citizens. Now, I know we will talk maybe a little bit about the citizen dialogues a little bit later, but you were really keen to make sure that citizens were part of this process.
Yes, and actually, if you look at the sweep, it's an example of how many different people have a stake in this food system. And one of the things that we tried to do is bring together, a lot of work has been done in different areas in the food system, and one of the things we tried to do is bring together voices from all of these sectors. And actually, if I look at this, I can have in mind the enormous number of people in each of these sectors who've helped us do this work. And it wouldn't be possible without the extraordinary support that we've had from people who've already been thinking about these issues in the system as it stands.
And one thing that people have said is the data set is astonishing. I mean, comprehensive, and really the first time that such a disparate amount of information about the system has been brought together in one place.
Yes, I mean, actually, there's one of the recommendations that we'll come on to is we need more data in the system. But I think that when you do an independent review, you are asked to give your views on what needs to change. But I think it's quite important that you leave a set of materials that will provide a reference point. So, you know, we collected data, we collected evidence on. I remember at the beginning of the process, we had a list of all the things we'd have to have views on. And, you know, it was 50 things. And the team spent a long time not only collecting the evidence, but testing it. You can actually pull together, what's extraordinary about the evidence is at the level of the name of the paper, you can pull together an argument that says almost anything. But actually, it's when you get your hands deep in the dirt of the data in these reports, as the team have done, that you really begin to uncover the true workings of the system.
Thank you. So I think we will leave it there because it's beginning to stabilise. Really interesting. Thank you so much. And thank you very much indeed for taking part in that. It proves the technology works and we can answer your questions a little later. So now, the moment you've been waiting for, as we say in television. Henry, over to you for how to fix the problems that we've talked about just now.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to talk through, to start with, the ideas that inform the recommendations. And you'll probably find that I talk, as I do in the report, about we a lot. And that's because genuinely this was a collective effort. Not only did we have huge support from all sorts of different areas of the sector, whether that's people in food banks, farmers, businesses, NGOs, we visited abattoirs. You know, we've really been welcomed wherever we looked, and that's been enormously valuable. But also the work of the civil service team who've been working on this under the extraordinary leadership of Tamsin Cooper. And I know probably many of you on this call today will have met Tamsin. And she really is, an asset to the civil service. And I'm sure that she will go on to work on these issues powerfully after this. When we started, we were obviously trying to think about how do you frame this? How do you bring this all together in one place? And we kind of talked to people who'd done reports in the past. We talked to experts and these kind of things, and they talked about taking a systems approach. And we spent quite a long time trying to flesh out exactly what a systems approach meant. And some people, when we first talked to them, would show us this chart, which is the Foresight obesity map. It was done for another piece of government work on obesity. And they'd say, well, what you need to understand is that it's very complicated and all these pieces are connected together. And that's fine, and it's true, but it's actually not very helpful in beginning to think about how you unpick it. What actions do you take? And if anything, I worry that charts like this just make people want to kind of fall back exhausted and give up. The other chart that we were shown quite a lot was Kelly Parsons' fantastic chart, actually, about how responsibilities for the food system are spread across government, and the fact that it is within government, it's a kind of there are different government departments fighting for different things, and that's definitely true. And we see it at the moment on trade, where DEFRA and the Department for International Trade clearly have different agendas. We saw it last year on the promotion restrictions, where Health, DHSC, and BEIS clearly, and in fact DCMS for the advertisers clearly had different interests, but it's not it's important to understand how you act on the system, but it's not fundamentally important to why the system has gone wrong in the way that it has. The other thing that we were asked was, is it all about trade-off? So is it all about, can you feed people in a sustainable way, cheaply? Can you combine animal welfare with low carbon, et cetera, et cetera? And trade-offs are critical, and we spend a lot of time dealing with trade-offs in the report. But again, it wasn't kind of the essence. And we found our inspiration for the essence in the work of system dynamics, the modeling of complex systems, which was pioneered in Massachusetts, and then basically modeling complex systems, seeing how they behave in certain ways. And what is interesting is we know that complex systems are hard to act upon, they're unpredictable, small changes in starting conditions can lead to very large differences in outcomes. But they do have certain features in common. And in her book, Donella Meadows, who was part of that Massachusetts group, Thinking in Systems, outlines some of the things that you need to do if you're going to stand a chance of managing a system, managing a complex system. And there were three things in particular that really shaped the whole of our report. One was to try and understand the feedback loops in the system that were going wrong, the things that really, where you needed to intervene to change the feedback loop in order to change the system. The second was realizing the limitations of your ability to know what effect your actions will have, and that informed a lot of the actions on data, which we'll come on to. And then the third was that actually, before you could change a system, you could put in as many policies as you wanted, but before you could actually have any chance of changing the system, you had to change the way in which people inside the system understood it and those outside. How does it actually work? And Donella Meadows talks about changing the paradigm. This is, as she describes it, as the shared idea in the minds of society, the great unstated assumptions that constitute the society's paradigm or deepest set of beliefs about how the world works. And there were three things in particular that we set out. That's why the report is set out sort of almost as a manifesto, because we hope that people will take some of the stories in there, some of the data in there, and use it to spread the word about how the system works. But there are three things that we wanted to change. First of all, we wanted to change this idea that the food system was a third or fourth order problem for society. It is actually one of the big issues that we face today, resolving the issues in the food system. In terms of the environment, this is a chart from the plan. This is us, the biomass of us and wild animals, vertebrates, so all birds and land mammals, in 12,000 years ago, before we started farming. And this is the picture now. This is the weight of all animals on Earth now. And what you can see is that farming has completely dominated the biosphere. So on the right, you've got many more people in blue. You've got wild animals now, many fewer than there were 12,000 years ago. We wiped out a lot of the megafauna, obviously, which would account for a lot of that. Animals that people eat, which are now 12 times the number of wild animals in terms of their weight, and then the little green thing at the top is pets. And so the way that we produce our food dominates the biosphere. It is by a great margin the leading cause of the destruction of nature, the reduction in biodiversity, the pollution and use of our fresh water, and alongside energy, it is by some margin the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. And that applies also to health. So if we look at health, and this chart shows risks from avoidable conditions that lead to ill health and death, and the purple circles represent things that are related to diet. And the fact is that diet-related disease is going to overwhelm the NHS if we don't do something about it. It's predicted that by 2035, we're going to be spending 1.5 times as much to treat type 2 diabetes as we currently spend on all cancer treatments. So we need to resolve it from a health perspective. And then from a kind of how do these effects kind of manifest themselves in society, the third issue with the food system being not a third or fourth order problem is that all of these problems visit themselves in a very concentrated way on the poorest people in our society. And this chart shows, for each of these charts, the left-hand side is the 10% most deprived areas, and the right-hand side is the 10% most popular, affluent areas in the country. And these are preventable mortality, heart disease, cancer, dental decay, childhood weight, and it's just horrific. All of these things play themselves out in ways that are much more concentrated amongst people who are already struggling. So that was the first idea we wanted to change, the idea that this wasn't a big problem. The second thing was one of the feedback loops. And this is a leader from The Sun talking about the restrictions on advertising that were put into place last year. They said, how about applying the same common sense to other failed measures, like the sugar tax, which won't trim an ounce off anyone's weight, then concentrate on the real solutions, better education on diet and exercise. And this idea that exercise, education and willpower are what will solve the diet-related health crisis are completely pervasive within society. And they simply aren't true. All of those things are demonstrably, scientifically false. So exercise, we show in the report that exercise is marginal benefit for helping you lose weight for all sorts of complicated reasons to do with the way the body operates. It's fantastic for everything else. It's like if you could prescribe exercise, it would make the drug companies a lot of money. It's very, very effective at preventing disease, but it's dreadful. It's not very good at helping you lose weight. And therefore, by saying this, by peddling this untruth, you actually get people to give up on doing, when they don't see they can't lose weight, you give up on doing the one thing that makes them, that exercise is great for. So they give up at exercise, it's not helping them lose weight, but actually it would be brilliant for a whole bunch of other things. And actually, I'm really pleased, The Sun, in their responses, I went to see them before it was published, and they didn't repeat this. I said, look, if you do anything, just don't repeat the exercise thing because it is not helpful, and they didn't repeat it. And I think that is one thing we need to change in society. We should embrace exercise, whatever our weight, however old, but not to help us lose weight. And education also, people know, we need some skills, and we'll come on to that, but people know they need to eat more veg, they need to eat less food. And we talk about a junk food cycle, which is this toxic connection between the diets that currently are made available to us and our appetite. Our appetite, this extraordinary evolutionary device that helps us eat the right amount of food, even not only the right amount, but seek out specific nutrients. And it is going disastrously wrong in the face of the what modern food production is giving us. And it's going wrong because 50% of our food is processed. A lot of that food is highly calorie dense, low in insoluble fiber, low in water, and that kind of food, not only are we programmed to seek out, because it used to be rare, but also it fills us up, it has lower satiety than other forms of food, and so we eat more of it. And there's some fantastic evidence on this. Left to your own devices, if you're faced with that food, you'll put on weight. If you're faced with food that is not like that, you won't. And over time, food companies, not through any ill will, have noticed that that's where they make the money. They've invested more in manufacturing and marketing those foods. We've eaten more, they've invested more. It's a vicious cycle. And they're as stuck in it as people who are struggling with diet-related conditions. So that was the second thing that we wanted to do. We wanted to create this idea of the junk food cycle and get away from these false ideas that actually, if you think about it, the corollary of this is that if you're not, if you haven't got the willpower to get off your own fat ass, then you deserve it, mate. And that is a really, really not only scientifically untrue, but pretty unkind way to treat other members of society. And then the third idea that we wanted to get across was actually not our idea at all, but it was from Partha Dasgupta's The Economics of Biodiversity, which was, I can recommend it, it's 600 pages long, and it is an extraordinary piece of work in the way in which we are overstepping the planetary boundaries. He's a renowned economist. It was commissioned by Treasury. And he starts by pointing out that nature actually is hard to notice. Much of it is silent, much of it's invisible, much of it's mobile. It doesn't care about borders or boundaries. And so we don't notice it. And not only do we not notice it, we don't measure it in any of the systems that we use to make decisions. It's not in the P&Ls of companies, it's not in their balance sheets, it's not in the way we measure GDP. And in fact, not only isn't it there, he estimates that countries around the world spend $500 billion a year actively subsidizing activities that destroy nature, whether that is the creation of nitrogen fertilizers or the production of fossil fuels, certain forms of fishing in certain countries. We're subsidizing the destruction of nature to a tune, he calculates, of $4 to $6 trillion every year. So we are actually not only not noticing nature, not valuing it, we're giving it a negative cost. We're paying people to destroy it. And a large part of the report looks at how that plays out in our food system. So how can we build a food system that not only provides enough food, nutritious food for us, and sequesters carbon and restores biodiversity, but does all of those three things together. And we started by realizing quite early on that there was a real danger in carbon on its own, because it's a single number. It's very easy to measure, and if you don't inextricably link biodiversity, renewal and carbon, you could get into a lot of problems. So we looked at the areas of land in the country where it was possible to not only to sequester carbon, but also to restore nature. And on this chart, the red areas, which you can see, kind of upland, new forest areas, the fenlands, are areas which lend themselves both to renewing nature and sequestering carbon. And what is also interesting about these areas is that they are also currently areas, with the exception of the fens, that produce a very low intensity, or very low, a very small amount of our food. So about 20% of our land, which is centered on most of these areas, produces about 3% of our food. And so you could begin to think about, how do we use our land better? How do we do these three things: create the food, sequester carbon, restore biodiversity? And you can start by working on that 20% of land. And if you look at that 20% of land, about between 5 and 8% of that you probably need to take out of food production altogether, or from very, very low conservation grazing in woodland, for example. But you need to take it out for broadleaf woodland and for peat restoral. The rest, you see a picture much more like, I'm sure many people here will have read James Rebank, but his description of a shaggier, more natural, flood protecting, carbon sequestrating, nature restoring, low intensity farming. That he, with his, I mean, he's actually, again, he's very honest about how this is a kind of joint effort in his valley and his area. So you would have that kind of farming in that 20%. And then the question is, what do you do on the remaining 80% of your land? And here the answer is really interesting. There's some fascinating work done by Finch et al., where they looked at, if you were to take the kind of extremes of the debate, so some people talk about what we need to do is do land sparing. We need to increase intensity everywhere and free up as much land to be wild as possible. Other people say, no, we have to do land sharing. We have to go back to an agroecological / organic approach, bring animals back into rotations, farm at lower intensities, but bring nature back in as part of the cycle. And what Finch et al. Did is they looked at various scenarios. So they looked at what happens if you intensify, what happens if you go to agroecological, and what happens if you do a bit of both. And what is interesting is that for the biodiversity, the bit of both is the best way to farm and restore nature. So you have a bunch of animals who love living on farms. We've had farms for a long time and who thrive on farms. You have others who like semi-wild land. And so you need to create a system, we argue, a three-compartment model where you have some farms that are agroecological, bringing ruminants back into the rotation, farming, accepting a lower level of productivity as previously defined. But actually, if you think about productivity and include nature and biodiversity restoration, then they're hugely productive farms. You have some farms that are higher yielding, and but not polluting. And then you have some land that's freed up to be semi-wild. And actually, between those two, there will be a vast array of different farms. And we give some examples of people who are combining kind of, the modern technology, the drones, the AI with traditional approaches. And so that is kind of central to the vision for the land that we set out, this three-compartment model, which you can see there in the bottom corner. The question then becomes, can you do that and feed enough food and produce enough food? And the answer is yes, but if you stop wasting as much food. And here we expand the definition of waste to refer to systemic waste. So on the left-hand side of this chart, you have how we use our land at the moment. Food crops, food crops at the bottom in purple, feed crops to feed animals in orange, and then pasture in blue. And if you, first of all, improve productivity, so that we think that there are, the DEFRA and I think a lot of farmers think there are real opportunities to share best practice, to improve yields on farms, yields of all sorts of farms, not just everyone moving to higher yielding farms. If you waste less food in the traditional way, throwing it away, and then if you eat less meat, so you're taking some of that food crop land, some of that pasture land, and you're using that to restore nature and to sequester carbon, you could actually feed this country on each of these are relatively timid suggestions, so increasing yields by 15%, eating 30% less meat, getting up to a kind of European average on food waste. You could actually produce the same amount of food with using a third of the land. So before we get on to how you actually make that come true, because there's huge jeopardy around that, and in particular farmers will be being asked at the same time as their basic payments are being pulled away, and we're doing trade deals, and we're experimenting with how to pay them for these things in a way that makes sense, so they don't just increase their intensity because they're worried about losing basic payments. There's huge jeopardy, and we'll come on to that. But what might this future look like? So if you had a diet in 10 years, in 2032, that increased fruit and veg by 30%, increased fibre by 50%, reduced foods high in fat, sugar and salt by 25%, and reduced meat and all kinds of meat by 30%, you would begin to have a diet that was both sustainable and healthy. And on that meat of 30%, we actually argue that at the moment, 50% of our meat is eaten in processed food. There is huge, this is not necessarily about removing the roast chicken on a Sunday or the steak. There's huge opportunity to take out the lower end meat and replace it with vegetables and other proteins. And actually you'd still have over 50% of our farmland would be farmed, for livestock. So how do you do that? Well, we set out 4 strategic objectives that you would need to achieve if you wanted to create the future that I've described. The first is to escape the junk food cycle and protect the NHS. The second is to reduce diet-related inequality. We think you have to tackle that head on. You can't wait for society to become more equal. You actually need to alleviate those harms in other ways. The third is to use our land more cannily, to make better use of the land. And finally, to create a long-term shift in our food culture. We do need to move back to a less processed world, a world where we eat more fruit and veg. And that is, we've come a long way down the road of our food culture that we're in. And part of what we do is about making the worst stuff a bit better, but we need to change our culture as well. And so all of the actions are set against those strategic objectives.
Henry, thank you very much indeed. Well, there you have it. Henry has framed the debate, and we'll now be moving in a moment to the second part of our session, where we'll be working through those 4 categories of recommendations. Henry will be expanding on them, and we'll be taking your questions as well. But just a reminder that you can use the Slido app to ask a question. Go to slido.com or scan the QR code, enter the code #foodstrategy, and then type in your question. And I know they have been flooding in, so brace yourself, Henry. But first of all, shall we go to those categories of recommendations? And let's start, shall we, with the junk food cycle.
Yes, so there are 3 recommendations that we recommend for the junk food cycle. Introduce a sugar and salt reformulation tax. So we think you need to really tackle it properly commercially. You need to we've worked with the Institute for Fiscal Studies to devise that. We've worked with Treasury to try and encourage reformulation, make the worst stuff less bad, and use about £1 billion of the revenue from that to fund the next set of actions that we'll come on to. And we estimate the impact of this could be huge. So the committee that recommends kind of calorie, where we need to get to on calorie consumption or obesity, estimated that if you, on average, across the population, reduce the number of calories by 24 per day per person, doesn't sound like a lot, but obviously averages don't spread out like that, you would stop us putting on weight. And this might take, the Institute of Fiscal Studies modelling, depending on how much reformulation there was, take between about 15 and 35 calories per day per person out of our diet. So it could be absolutely massive. The second is to have large food companies, both out of home and in home, reporting not only at a high level what they're selling, but broken down by protein types, by foods that are high in sugar, fat, and salt, by environmental issues. And actually, a number of the supermarkets have said that they want to be mandated to do this. And then the third thing is a huge push on schools. Now, I said that education wasn't necessarily the way out of the obesity problem. What I meant by that is knowledge. But there is a huge skill gap and a huge culture gap. And cooking is not taken seriously in schools. Part of the work I did on the school food plan with my business partner, John Vincent, cooking was compulsory on the curriculum up to the age of 14, and you were asked not just to make cupcakes, but a range of savoury dishes, and not enough people are doing it. So this is a big package to take that serious, to kind of take that seriously again. And I'd say, by the way, that on this, a number of people have said, how do we make this happen? Because we've been trying to make this happen forever. This is the one that all of the newspapers, everyone in society thinks this should happen. So there's an enormous possibility for a campaign to make this happen, because there's literally no one who doesn't think it should happen.
We'll take some questions from the Slido app in just a moment on this section. But I'd like to pick you up, if I may, on a couple of things, and then ask a question about the tax and particularly the Prime Minister's response. But you say 15 calories. Now, we all know, depressingly, how much exercise you have to do to burn off 15 calories, as you were saying. But that sounds like a tiny amount. And really, is that going to make a difference?
Well, 24 calories a day per person is 2 kilos by the end of the year. So the problem with the exercise piece is that when you exercise, your body actually just reallocates calories from other uses. So if you did 25 calories more exercise a day, you would not lose weight. But if you reduce by a small amount the amount of calories you're eating, the evidence suggests that you will lose weight. Now, obviously, also, when you're calculating that, there are some people who are eating a lot more sugar than others. That is averaged over children and adults, etc. So in some people, it would be much more. But when you eat, it is the case that small amounts add up. Unfortunately, small amounts of exercise don't seem to add up.
And the Eat and Learn initiative, that is something that, as you said, many people have said it's about time. So why hasn't it happened? I mean, everybody's been saying for 20 years, since we all used to come home when we were little with our Victoria sponge cakes, and that just doesn't happen anymore. So why doesn't it if everybody agrees?
Well, so I think there are two reasons. First of all, it is not the case that everyone has always agreed. So there was definitely a sense that food tech, what used to be home economics, was a bit of fun. And, when I went around schools in 2013, I can't remember, around 7 cookery lessons just to do a bit of research to begin with. And the first 4 I went into were cooking cupcakes. So it was kind of, not taken very seriously and a bit of fun. That, I think, is beginning to change, but there are still some, Dyson, for example, when we did our work and it was put onto the curriculum, was outraged that people would be learning to cook instead of learning engineering. And I just think those voices, as we see what's happening in society, it's pretty important not to have people dying from what they eat and miserable. So I think that side is beginning to move. The second reason it's not happening is it's actually quite difficult. And so, I've set up since 2013 with an amazing woman called Nicole Pisani, a charity called Chefs in Schools, and we go into schools and try and change the food that's served and the way cooking lessons are taught. And it's hard, and you can't pass a law. We say in the report, you can't pass a law that makes people, you can't send head teachers to prison if it's not working, or send in the army to teach people to cook. It takes care, and that's why there are a number of sub-recommendations within this that are kind of structurally putting it on a par with maths and English. But then there's another one, which is that all schools should have some kind of accreditation body like Food for Life, which not only measures their progress, but trains them and helps them do it, because it's not easy.
So if I may get back to that main, the one that grabbed a lot of headlines, the sugar and salt reformulation tax. Now, the Prime Minister on the day of the launch last week kind of dismissed it in a single sentence. Other people have accused you of, and I quote, sniffing glue. I mean, is this not I'm not quite sure how that works together, but there you go. Is it not the case that this is now, as a strategy, hold below the waterline? Because this was a key plank, surely, of how you get the money to do all the other stuff that you've been talking about.
So, no, I mean, the danger when you do an independent report, there's always a danger that nothing gets done. This is my third now after the last 2, and pretty much all of the recommendations in the previous 2 have been done, but you're always hostage to fortune. I was saying to someone the other day, on the first day, you just don't want the Prime Minister to shoot it down. But actually, if you listen to what he said, your Prime Minister, you're bounced into these things. It's a 280-page report. There's no way he'd read it. He gets asked a question. What he said was, I'm not attracted to extra taxes for hardworking people. And who is, right? That's not the point. The point is to try and create reformulation to get the worst out of these foods and then use some of that money to support diets in other ways. So actually, I think, we spent a long time talking to different people in government. So no one is now denying that there's a problem. So that's point 1. So there's a problem. We've got to fix it. I think most people have now bought the line that education, exercise and willpower is not going to get you out of it. They understand that this junk food thing is going on. And a lot of the CEOs of big food companies said, we need support. We need intervention to help us get out of this. So then the question is, what is the intervention? And that is a process that takes longer. So there's an enormous amount of research in it that will go into the machine and people will try and work it out. So I'm actually still optimistic that one may happen.
Well, but as you said, you and I both worked on strategies before for the government. There's a yes, and there's a yes, no, isn't and so which of the two are you actually genuinely getting? Is that the yes, we're interested, and yes, we actually are going to do something, or yes, we're interested, but no, we're going to put it on a shelf?
Oh, I think they're really interested and they're really worried because it's not, there's a certain part of their party for whom it's instinctively just not right. But what's interesting is that we did a lot of research because we wanted to kind of understand what could be done. And we did focus groups and citizens' dialogues. And even amongst low-income groups, there is a real understanding that sugar and salt are real problems and that there is a will for government to intervene. So actually, we think this thing, if framed right, is possible to do and could be hugely beneficial.
Fantastic. Well, let's have a look at some of the Slido questions. And just a reminder that don't worry if you feel you haven't got your question in the right bit of the recommendations that we're talking about. We'll have time for to mop up some of the questions that we might have missed as we work our way through. Do we have, and there we go, as if by magic, how do you propose consumers eat less processed foods considering the society in which we live, in which most people have to work full time? And there's no getting away from the fact that convenience, we've all been there. You get home after a full day at work, you know that the kids are going to eat fish fingers and oven chips. There won't be any waste. It'll be 30 minutes in the oven and you can sit down, hopefully with a glass of wine and enjoy the rest of your evening. So very good question. How do you propose we do that?
So I think you rightly brought in a question about people who are really struggling for cash. So it is definitely the case that if you're really struggling, for example, feeding your children, you don't want to feed them something they're not going to eat. And so you fall back on things that are, maybe a bit less good for them, but they'll eat and get a belly full. And we deal with that in Objective 2. I am actually, people say, how can you get out of this processed food world that we're in? And I am relatively optimistic that if we want to, we can. So we've changed our food culture beyond recognition since the war. Others haven't. So, we eat 50% of our foods are processed. Italy, it's 14%. And I think that if we want to, we can rebuild those skills with the education and the training. And then also there are some recommendations further down that we'll come on to in terms of changing the culture. But don't think it's not hard. And that's why I think you also need to make the processed food better.
There was a question that we just here, there we go, as if by magic. Does a sugar and salt tax, I think you've kind of answered this question, but that poorest demographic, people who are struggling with everything, is it not just yet another burden on them effectively? Yeah.
So, as I said, the purpose of this tax is to reformulate food, not to pass on the cost. And if you look at sugary drinks, that was hugely successful. 20-30% of the sugars come out of sugary drinks. But you're right to say there might be some products that are difficult to reformulate and that the manufacturers pass on the cost. So to give an example of what that might look like, a Mars bar might go from being 65, if there was no reformulation, of being 65p to 74p, 9 pence difference. I think a lot of that will be reformulated, but some of it might not. And we've done two things. We've looked at the total basket cost of what if there was no reformulation, how much would baskets go up? It's not a huge change, for a household with a average household, 95 quid food basket for a week. It's just over £1. But you still have those people who are really struggling. And that's why for those, we've introduced the recommendations in Objective 2. And actually, interestingly, for the policy wonks, a hypothecated tax, so a tax where you say specifically this money is going to something else, generally by economists are not looked on favourably. But in this case, if you're trying to create a system that isn't regressive, to have one tax that may put prices up a little bit that end, and then another which will take some of that money but then puts it back in amongst the least affluent, that is a coherent way in which to devise a kind of taxation approach.
Thanks, Henry. We'll take one more question before we move on to the second tranche of recommendations. It's just popped off, but it was there, the number 2 on that list. So it's kind of looking through the other end of the telescope. Why not have a subsidy for fruit and veg instead of a tax, which would be more of an incentive and less of a feeling as though you're increasing the burden on some people?
The problem with the subsidy for fruit and veg is you're effectively giving a huge summary to a lot of wealthy people who already eat fruit and veg. So that is, I don't think, a good use of taxpayers' money to give Waitrose customers, nothing wrong with Waitrose, a lovely place, but to give more affluent...
For example, other supermarkets are available.
Other supermarkets, but, but to give people who already have a good amount of money, to make my carrots cheaper, to take your taxes as someone who's really struggling to get by and use them to make my carrots cheaper doesn't make sense. So what we have done is to, effectively with the Healthy Start vouchers, which we'll come on to again, give fruit and veg vouchers, so make them free for people who are really struggling with kids. So we have done that, but not to everyone.
Thanks very much. So let's move on now to the second set of recommendations that you have around diet-related inequality.
Yeah, so this is the £1 billion of money that is redistributed. And there are 3 things for families with children here. So extending eligibility of free school meals to everyone who before benefits is earning under £20,000. That's another about 1 million more children getting free school meals. And that would take, if you look at the government's own assessments of food insecurity, that would mean that about 82% of people who currently very food insecure would get free school meals. There may be, if you could get the data, other ways that you could find out who that extra chunk at the top was, but you would need the government, the DWP, detailed data to do that. The second piece is then, during the holidays, funding the holiday activities and food programme. So this is the stuff that was recommended in Part 1, that was campaigned for by Marcus Rashford, that has just started. And in the schools that we're in, it's been just, the last couple of days have been amazing. Seeing the kids coming out, getting good food, getting activities, out of lockdown, getting back into their communities, really fantastic. Not only supporting diets during the holidays, but also doing so much more. The third piece is the Healthy Start scheme. So this is a scheme that provides, at the moment, for a very small number of people, provides vouchers that used to be £3.50, now £4.25, again, following Part 1, which is our recommendation, for fruit and veg. So literally you go to the supermarket. They're now making it digital so you don't get the horrible stigma of pulling the vouchers out of your wallet. And we think that that could be massive. There's great evidence that helps people eat more fruit and veg. One of our advisory panel members, who's a citizen who has struggled to feed her kids in the past because of finances, said just being able to put a bowl of fruit on the table and not feel guilty about it was a huge benefit. And actually, as I said, the evidence shows that people eat more fruit and veg. And then the final thing is a really interesting idea taken from America. So they've done these pilots of social prescribing in Ohio and Washington, where you take people who are already struggling with diet-related diseases or in a high-risk group and who don't have a lot of cash, and you prescribe them literally fruit and veg, so with it would be a similar voucher to the Eat Well one, cookery lessons, visits to supermarkets to help them change the way in which they cook and eat and feed themselves. And those, really, really interesting data coming out of those. And the idea is that you actually pay for themselves because you don't have to pay for the diabetes drugs or whatever it is further down the line. And that's for a pilot to try those in 6 areas.
If we could perhaps just unpack that a little bit. I've been involved in a scheme looking to see whether you could begin to fund mental health, well-being activities using land, using our national parks, using our farmland. And the difficulty is doctors go, yeah, that's a brilliant idea, but what I'll do is I'll just keep all my prescribing money because I'm going to need it. If you could just fund that as well, that would be fantastic. I mean, surely what we need is, if we're going to make a real shift, is to start using some of the considerable resources the NHS have to do this, rather than expecting this to be funded from a tax which, as you yourself have said, will not be there forever as companies reformulate.
Yes, I mean, I think that this is a trial, so this is £6 million to do these trials. I actually think this. I sense within DHSC, Department of Health and Social Care, there's a real shift towards this. They're making Chris Whitty the head of the Office for Health Prevention. It's all about stopping things before they happen. So I think the whole paradigm that we have of basically seeing the health service as something that mops up the problems of society once they've happened is it's going to have to be reversed. We're never going to be able to deal with it unless it isn't. So I'm actually more optimistic that you might get movement in some of these areas.
So let's spool back to this suite of measures as a whole. The Right to Food campaigners have said that you've actually just missed an opportunity to end food policy. And I know, we've had this discussion in the advisory panel. Surely the answer actually is to pay people more. I mean, you yourself say when people get a higher income, they spend it on healthier food because they have the means to do so, rather than a kind of statist measure where you give people a voucher. Just pay them more money.
Yeah. So I think what I said about that in the plan, first of all, it was really interesting. So when we discussed it with the citizens, everyone, including low-income groups, had a sadly pessimistic view of how other people would behave. So they said basically that if you give people more benefits, they'll spend it on cigarettes and alcohol. And we point out in the plan that's just not true. When you give people more income, they eat better, and they actually tend to spend less on cigarettes and alcohol. So we kind of want to burst that myth. I then say, if I look at the kind of huge scope, it was 288 pages. If you're going to make a welfare recommendation, you have to understand the whole welfare system, and that wasn't within my scope, and I didn't have the time to do it. So I didn't make a recommendation, but I did say that I think that universal credit should cover the cost of a healthy, sustainable diet. Having said that, I still think it makes sense to support diets in this way. So some say it's paternalistic, healthy start scheme, why don't you just give them the cash? Well, the evidence shows that if you give them the vouchers, they eat more fruit and veg, it's better for them. If they're already eating the fruit and veg, it's effectively more cash because they just have £4.25 left to spend on something else. So I actually would argue that's a really, that is an area where people's kind of ideas about how the world should work and the kind of paradigm, and people get quite upset about giving them anything but cash, giving people anything but cash. I actually don't think that's right, in my judgment.
We've had a pre-submitted question from Louise Davis from the Food Teachers Centre, who asks, schools are making decisions to remove or reduce food or nutrition lessons now. Can these recommendations on food education be implemented quickly?
Well, so the way to get them implemented quickly is persuade the government to do it. I think you've got an open door here. If I were you, Louise, I would get together coalition, including Tom Kerridge, maybe Marcus. They've been doing cooking, and do a campaign with the Sun. The Sun are absolutely desperate to make this kind of thing happen. And I think you just Nick Gibb, I think, is the minister. I think you just need to massively up the noise and energy in this area. And I think there's a real opportunity to do it on the back of these recommendations.
Well, in a moment, we'll go to some more Slido questions, but just one more question on this tranche of recommendations. We've spoken before of how that getting food education into schools, one of the areas where food is still prepared because you have to is in diverse communities, because you simply can't get the food you want to in a processed way. Is there a way of linking up with faith groups, with diverse community groups as well, to get this to start happening? Because, of course, what you need, every time you talk about a school, you need a person to go into that school to help with that cooking.
Yes, and actually there's a fund, a £500 million fund recommendation in Objective 4, which is exactly about giving people money to prove that those kind of interventions can work. So we'll talk about this a bit more, but historically, again, it's like the drug question. The idea of innovation has always been, it's about, in the food area, it's about science, it's about genes, it's about products that do things better, it's about AI, it's about data, but there's a huge amount of social innovation, ways in which societies can organise themselves that can have as radical results as the technology. And the fantastic thing is we've got an amazing new boss of UKRI who spent our innovation money, Osline Lacer, who really gets that deep in her gut. And so I think, again, you're going to see some quite radical things. We recommend some quite radical innovation coming out to support those people.
Well, we'll move on in a bit to healthy guts and healthy soils, but let's have a quick look at the Slido questions. And there, so is teaching cooking something that might be better done in the community with families, including children rather at schools? A little bit rather like the question we've just talked about, but actually bringing it back into the home rather than in the school environment.
I think that you can. I think that there are people who do good work teaching communities to cook. A lot of the schools do, the schools that we work in do things like lads and dads cooking, where you have joint cooking lessons for dads and their sons. Often resulting in a dinner at the end of term where they cook a dinner for all the mothers. And I think there is an opportunity there, but I think that the school, and I know I speak to a lot of head teachers, I know a lot is asked of them, but I do think there is something fundamental about the fact they have to do cookery lessons, the fact that 50% of food that children eat during term time is at school. I think we do have to get it right in schools.
And a question on Marcus Rashford, as you mentioned him. Will he be involved in the principal? Have you engaged him? Are there going to be an army of celebrities to support this?
So I don't know. He's obviously been quite busy since in the last couple of weeks.
Had his hand full.
It's interesting. Marcus is an extraordinary person. The reason that he got involved last time round was kind of weird. He'd been doing his campaigning. I sent part one to someone in Manchester United who I knew and said, could you get it to him? He passed it on to him, and then Marcus got in touch with me last September to say, I'd like to get behind this. So, I don't know is the answer. I think he'll like the recommendations, but, he's got to decide what he needs to do next.
We are very lucky to have such amazing young ambassadors, aren't we, really?
I actually think he should, this is fine, I think he should, I sent a letter into government the other day saying I think he should be made a lord, because I think you need those kind of voices properly, like talking, and why do you have to get to the age of 60 before you're a lord? Lord Rashford, that's what I'm all about.
You heard it.
That's going to be my campaign for the next 6 months.
I was going to say, you heard it here first, hashtag Lord Rashford. So, Henry, let's move on to section 3 now, the making the best use of our land. And of course, questions around meat consumption or not. And I know this has been quite a controversial part of the strategy since it came out last week.
Yes, so there are going back to meat. There are 6 chapters on on meat, and not all meat is the same. And we're a lot of the stuff that's been seen outside is people see the 30% figure and and assume that that's all we have to say. So what do we have to say? The first thing is we think that the government should not only guarantee the £2.4 billion of Common Agricultural Policy money that it is repurposing to the Environmental Land Management Scheme payments for this Parliament, for a Parliament after that. I can actually see, I think by that stage, the benefits will be so clear it will be impossible to cut. I didn't say, you could have said forever, but I don't think you can ever recommend anything forever. So, but it definitely is too soon to have it running out in 2025. farmers need a bit of road. It's going to take a time to work out exactly how to do it best. Once you've got that, you need to create a rural land use framework. So you actually need to be clear. You can't, because of private ownership and because a lot of decisions are made locally, rightly, you can't kind of have a Stalinist approach, say we'll do this with this bit of land, this with that bit of land. But you do need to be clear about what land would be best suited for what purposes. So if you look at the 3-compartment model, just thinking about where we should be doing what and how our subsidies should be aligned to do that. So the government should say, here's what we think it is. They should actually get a map, digital map, high resolution, that sets out all of the data on land quality, what's being produced where, and say this broadly is what the transition, this is how much broadleaf woodland we want, here are some of the areas where we think that could be good, here's peat restoration areas, here's the productivity of farming, and here are the payments that would support that. Part of that payment on the 3-compartment model should be directly supporting agriculture on regenerative agroecological farms, so paying farmers to farm more for nature, bringing ruminants back into rotations, et cetera, et cetera. And then the third piece is that none of this works, this farming thing works, if you don't get your trade deals right. So we could create a beautiful zero-carbon island bursting with biodiversity. And if we then signed a trade deal, in particular with Brazil or the US, that was zero quota, zero tariff, you would effectively just offshore a lot of that harm. You'd move the environmental damage from here to abroad. You'd move the carbon emissions from here to abroad. You'd move the animal welfare harms from here to abroad, and simultaneously wipe out a large part of your rural community and farming. And that is just, for me, if I were to fight for anything on these, this is the kind of clear and present danger that we don't get our trade deals right. We're yet to see what the Australian deal has in its animal welfare chapter, but it feels to me as if the government's moving in the wrong direction on that. And I think that they could probably get away with the Australian deal just because of the amount of the food they produce. But if you do that kind of deal with US and Brazil, we're in real trouble.
We'll move on to the meat debate in a moment. But first, if I could perhaps to ask you about the whole basis of the 3-compartment model, because there will be farmers up and down the country, even engaged farmers, who are saying, really, we've got climate change, we've got zero carbon, we've got to produce this, we've got to do that, we've got biodiversity, we've got the list of things we're being asked to produce is as long as your arm. Oh, and by the way, still stay in profit. And now there's yet another scheme, which is 3 instead of 2, that we've got to try and get our heads around as well. I mean, it's easy to see why people, even who are really keen on regenerative farming and supporting biodiversity, are kind of just exhausted with all the change.
I mean, I actually think the 3-compartment model, all that does is enable people to do the non-food bit in different kinds of ways and to acknowledge that not everyone has to do the same thing. I think the things that, having spoken to a lot of farmers and continuing to speak to a lot of farmers, I think the things that they're really worried about are, number one, that the payments that are made under the new ELMs won't actually incentivise them fairly to do the things that the government's asking them to do. And there's still, we're waiting to see. There's definitely enough money to incentivise them properly, but that is a real concern. So if you're sitting there with your basic payments coming down, and you know how much they're going to come down by, but you don't know what you're going to be paid for yet, that's scary. You're thinking, well, do I just need to intensify? So there's that worry. And then at the same time, seeing the mood music on trade turns that worry into something that makes you think the government isn't operating in a joined-up way on this. So actually, the 3-compartment model is actually just a way of allowing people to do what they're good at and to choose how they farm, and providing the payments, not subsidies, payments, to build carbon sequestration and biodiversity restoration into their farming models. And some people will do that in a very low yield, the James Rebanks model that we talk about in the report. And then some people like Craig Livingston, who was on our advisory board, he's kind of constantly trying to maintain his yield. He is a conventional arable farmer who has got his nitrogen use down by 40% and pesticide use down by 30% at the same yields by farming in a different way. And I think, the three compartment model is just trying to incentivize people to do what they're good at, what their land is suited to.
I know we've got lots and lots of questions on the Slido, so let's go straight to that. I have an inkling what some of this will be. Okay, so Alan Buckwell asked, to make lower intensity farming profitable, does this require higher farm gate food prices, as is the case for organic food?
Well, I think we have a problem with, so yes, I think in some cases, yes. I think we have a problem with farm gate food price in this country. We have been very resistant to cooperatisation in this country. We have farmers do not generally, it's happening actually, one of the most extraordinary things that's happened in recent times is the huge numbers of farm clusters working together. But I think the solution to that is much tighter cooperation between farmers to get some bargaining power in the system. Because at the moment, they're just price takers.
But if you're saying, okay, farm gate prices are going to increase, we might see an increase in prices because of the reformulation. I mean, it's incremental, but if you're on a really limited income, you'll be thinking, well, hang on, I've got to eat less meat and I've got all these other things that are going to increase the price of the things that I'm eating. Is that not a recipe for a big hit in your wallet at the end?
Well, the farm gate prices, there's such a small percentage of the total cost of the food by the time it gets to the consumer. I don't think actually that represents a huge increase at all. All the value add along the chain means that you could have relatively small increases in farm gate prices which don't really, the consumer doesn't see very much.
Okay, thanks. So Paul Clark asks, what are the implications for vision leadership and policy making, given the cutting nature of the food system?
Cross-cutting nature.
Cross-cutting, oh, sorry, yes. Didn't be too literal there, as a dress rehearsal for tackling climate change. And I think it's a good opener for that whole question about should we be seeing this through the lens of the climate emergency as well?
I think we should. I think if we could remember that question, I think we might address that when we've talked about Objective 4, because I think it is important.
A question from Anonymous, which has, we could really talk about it at any of these junctures. Systems Thinking said we should focus on purpose. Are we clear what the new purpose and goals of the system?
Yes, so and we set out the goals in chapter 16, but in a nutshell, with the Borlaug movement, we focused on creating a food system that delivered the maximum number of calories from any given piece of land. That was the objective, because we were running out of land. In the old days, we had simply, when population increased, tilled more land and fed people off more land, and we had to stop that connection. And that focus simply on that meant that, as we said at the beginning, that the farm system went under ways. At its simplest, we're trying to create a food system that feeds us, restores nature, and sequesters carbon. We need to sequester. It's not enough for the farming system just to be net zero. It actually needs to sequester emissions from other sectors. So that is the new goal, is to do those three things.
There's a question about farming education. Should we not, which kind of links the second and third category of recommendations, do we not need to teach our young people where their food comes from and how it's grown? And we desperately need new entrants in farming and in horticulture.
Yes, definitely. So if you look at there's quite a lot of that in the education piece. I think also there's the EFI initiative, which is kind of a What Works centre that is being set up, or the process of being set up by DEFRA, to spread best practice amongst farmers, to educate people who are already in the system, and to work out what works. So there are all these new things that people are doing, and there's just so much information that farmers are being bombarded by. We think, and this again is an objective for, but we think you need to take that and really double down on it, give it a £50 million endowment, because we need to be working out not just what works in terms of genes, but what works in terms of farming practices, and then spreading that, educating farmers that way as well.
We'll take a couple more questions before we move on to the final set of recommendations. This question about intense farmed livestock is greener than outdoor. So you make the point in the report that, relatively speaking, you can't always assume that if something's intensively reared, it is higher carbon. The question is, will people take that out of context? Do you want to have a think about that?
Well, I didn't quite get the question, sorry.
So,
I couldn't see which one it was on the chart.
So it's right at the top here. So do worry citizens may take intensive farmed livestock is greener than outdoor reared messaging?
I don't know. I think that the consumer is so far away from, like, basically the consumer just understands, you know, talking at length to people who look at how consumers read labels, they kind of get that a red traffic light is probably bad from a nutritional point of view. On the environment at the moment, they like British. And one of the recommendations is we need to create environmental labelling on things. But I think we're miles away from where the consumer, what we need to do is try and get the incentives right so that you are paying farmers for rearing, for animal welfare, for carbon sequestration in this, you know, in the system. I don't think the consumer's anywhere near that at the moment, so I'm not worried about that. It's like people also ask me on the diet side, did I worry about some of the language I use in the junk food cycle, because that's going to make citizens feel guilty, bad, etc. And I just think it's you've got to be really careful about the way in which you talk, the stigma, etc. But this is about massive societal problem in a government report that's going to be read by people who are creating policy. So I think you have to separate the audiences, and you know, otherwise you would never be able to say anything.
We'll move on to the final final set of recommendations, because amazingly, after having thought we've got 90 whole minutes, we're kind of running out of time. So let's get to these final set of recommendations and then take as many questions as we can, just to finish with. So the long-term shift in the food culture, which is really the summation of the parts that we've just spoken about, I guess.
Yeah, so this is really to Paul Clark's question on the previously, which is how do you do? You know, there was some fantastic work done on this by among others Tim Lang, Andrew Jarvis, whatever it was, 10 years, 12, 14 years ago, and there was a kind of cross-government committee set up, and you know, and then it all just kind of petered out. You know, government lost interest, and then someone has to do it again. And so the question is, how do you try and create a kind of enough energy that we push off and we keep going, we snowball rather than you know, whatever the analogy is. And so this is what this is trying to do. So what we've said here is basically on these four things: you need to invest in innovation, you need to take data seriously, government needs to lead the way, and you need to have measures in place for that keep government engagement over the long term, over terms of parliament, over the day-to-day thrust of politics. So on the innovation, that is a £1 billion package. 500 million of that is through UKRI, looking at ways in which you can make food systems sustainable and healthier, but not just for academic research, much more focus on the community level, the kind of stuff you talked about, on entrepreneurs, on people who are actually showing how you can put ideas into practice to prove that you can change the system, rather than working kind of on research that's miles above the pace of change. As I said, Ottoline Lacer, the new head of UKRI, really instinctively gets this stuff and was very helpful actually thinking it through, and I think that could be very powerful. There are then a couple of other pots of money in there. There's the 280 million that DEFRA has already said it's going to be putting into research and innovation in the sector, but we say that needs to be not just, again, about genetics. It needs to be looking at methane suppression in livestock, but also some of the stuff that we've been talking about, how you share innovation between farmers. And then there is setting up two What Works centres, the EFI that we talked about, and another one on healthy diets, on healthy sustainable diets, looking at the evidence, the policy evidence for what works, in the way that the Education Endowment Fund did. And then finally, some money to set up a centre for novel proteins, for plant-based proteins, to see if we can get some of that processed meat protein out and replace it with plant proteins.
Sorry.
Shall I go through?
Yes.
So then the data programme, Kofi Annan, did a wonderful, wrote a wonderful piece about how they dealt with malnutrition in Africa. And he pointed out that creating these digital maps of the problem helped massively in two ways. First of all, when you mapped out these things visually, everyone could see that there was a kind of moral incentive to act, because you could not hide from this. Otherwise you got a report, it was on a PowerPoint page, it was like, this is how bad malnutrition is. He said here, it was like you could zoom in on any area next to you. It brought the whole thing to life. And then it also enabled you to focus on a much more local area and where the problems were. And this is actually, Patrick Vallance is big on this in government. Government needs to be creating these maps, needs to be creating this data, collecting the data about the food system and sharing it, and using tools that people can use to envisage it in certain ways. So we think this is very geeky recommendation, but actually incredibly powerful. Government should be using the money that they spend to buy healthy, sustainable food. That means creating a new reference diet. At the moment, it's optional. It shouldn't be optional. And then finally, there are quite a few statutory targets, but there's nothing on biodiversity that government's committed to, and there's nothing on health. And we think that those should go into a food bill to be put through next year, along with other legislative changes which will hold the government to account over periods of Parliament. So the Food Standards Agency, for example, taking on a responsibility not just for health, but to hold the government to account on sustainability, sorry, not just for safety, but to hold the government to account on sustainability and health as well. And I think that what you have there is a mechanism to keep government focused on it. In the end, politicians are the ones who make the decisions. And so in addition to this, and this was part of the point of the kind of manifesto element of the plan, is we need civil society, business leaders to kind of keep the pressure on, talk about the food system in a certain way. And I think that if you have that combination of these structural things plus energy from outside, you've got a real chance of changing the system.
We've got about 5 minutes left for questions. So let's go straight to the Slido, because I know we've had a huge amount. Thank you so much for everybody who sent in their questions. Dan Crossley from the Food Ethics Council, the strategy is more than just 14 recommendations. How can we, you've touched on this, but how can we all help government respond positively so it doesn't just cherry pick a couple?
So I think, what happens after this is we have a spending review coming up in this autumn. We have a white paper. The government said it will respond after 6 months. And I think what we need is to there are two things that people can do. One is they can keep the conversation going. And I think specifically, this will morph into 3 campaigns. There'll be a campaign on the health side, the education side. There'll be a campaign on inequality and the food poverty side. And there'll be a campaign on trade and the farming side. And I think that the best way we've got those moments of the spending review and the white paper. The best way is for people who care about these to align themselves and keep the rhetoric, the data alive as we lead into those government decisions. We've also got COP coming up, which is important too.
We had a pre-submitted question from Tony Bambridge, who is himself a farmer, and he makes this point, to your point about the data set, that agriculture is very fragmented. You know, when you say farmer, you could be talking about someone with 20,000 acres or someone with a couple of hectares of permaculture. Who's going to make the decisions on what good looks like, and who's going to fund that data set that you'll require for potentially a massive transformation with technology and your three compartment model?
So in terms of farming, the idea of the EFI, What Works Centre, is that they define, we've got the government, we've got the government commitments on biodiversity and climate, and then you've got like what policy is there, and that is the EFI. But you also need, in the end, what is going to change farming is that £2.4 billion of payments. And so in the end, it will be DEFRA, the Secretary of State of DEFRA, that makes that decision, because that will affect everything else, and also the trade piece, obviously.
And another, I guess, question building on that from Dr. Simon Miller from the Torbay Coast and Countryside Trusts, and he asked, how can we dismantle generations of that rural and urban difference? Because we've touched on that, but not really talked about it in detail, and ensure that farmers have a valued and respected place in their societies and communities.
Yeah, farmers are not in a trite way, they're the custodians of the land. The idea that we're going to make this transition without farmers leading it, and as you say, not just the land, but the communities, like the backbone of many of these communities, is a nonsense. And I think that, if you a year ago, we were talking about, or a year or 2 years ago, the debate was about income foregone, as a method of payment. And I think we have to recognise that we are asking farmers to do valuable things, pay them to do valuable things for society. And unless we pay them properly, they will probably just intensify. That's the way they will make their money. And there's a little bit of analysis in the report where we look at the average farmer, and the average farmer, if you look at the wage rates that, say, the Forestry Commission have for manual labour, the average farmer pulls in about £20,000 a year, and on top of that does £28,000 of unpaid labour a year. So getting that right is absolutely critical, and that is about really understanding when you're paying public money for public goods, you need to pay people properly to deliver those public goods.
One final question. I did promise we'd come back to the meat debate, and you've got 2 whole minutes to answer it. So we've had lots of farmers getting in touch saying, well, we are all grass-fed, why are you penalising us? And on the other hand, people saying, well, why didn't you just, come out with this and say we've got to have a meat tax if you really want people to eat a third less meat?
So I think on the meat tax, it is very difficult to do because it's so varied, the production. Even amongst beef, there's huge variances in carbon, and how you track a particular cow, how it's been brought, it's very difficult. Also, unlike the sugar tax, there's a large percentage of the population who are violently against it, in particular because it would be very regressive. So mince would go from about £4 to £11 a kilo. If you were to do a current carbon price. So it's very, very difficult. In terms of, good versus bad meat, 30% is not a lot of meat reduction. It sounds like a lot, but it's 7 days to 5 days of eating meat. And we do need some of that pasture. We need some of that pasture back. Pasture-fed meat is fantastic. It's good. It restores soil, et cetera, et cetera. But we need to use some of that land for slightly more, to restore carbon, basically, for broadleaf woodland. So that's kind of why. But it's very difficult balance. And if you don't do your trade deals right, you don't get it right.
We have had a very wide-ranging discussion, Henry, and thank you very much for fielding all those questions. Could you perhaps give us some of your final thoughts? And I know that, as you said, this is a manifesto, so that rather assumes a call to action. What is that call to action, and who should be heeding it?
Well, I think there's such a diverse group of people watching this session. There are 2 things I think they can do. The first thing is be part of changing the narrative. So take if you like what it says, take the parts of it you like and spread the word, because we need to change the narrative on the junk food cycle. We need to change the narrative on the role of the farmer and on how we address the invisibility of nature. So that's the first thing. And if appropriate, look at those various points that we talked about and how you can be spreading the word up to the spending review, up to the up to COP, up to the white paper. The second thing I'd say is that there's only so much government can do. And we make the observation that every plate of food that has ever been served, nutritious, delicious plate of food that's ever been served to any human being in the whole of human history has been served because someone took the care to do it. And that is something that can only be done on a local level. And a lot of this change, particularly things like schools, hospitals, changing the food in communities, will be due because some people decide to make a difference. And I would say, like, what is the change that you can make in your own community? Literally writing a letter to the head or going and seeing, ask to go and see what your children are eating at school. Just that could be just what it takes to begin a snowball to be the change. So just like lean in any, however small a way, into changing your area, because actually in the end, it's by tens, hundreds, thousands, and millions of people leaning in a bit, trying to change it locally, that will get the real profound change that we need.
Henry, thank you so much. Thanks very much for answering a plethora of questions and having all the facts and figures at your fingertips. And a very warm thank you from us here in the studio as well. And thank you for your passion, your engagement, your questions, and your support all the way through this long process. What next, Henry? What are you doing next?
For me,
apart from a holiday.
I've got to spend some time with my family. And then I'm going to kind of, there are areas that I'm very keen to stay involved in, probably do a bit of campaigning in, but I'm going to kind of think that through over the summer, like exactly how I want to be involved. And it's something now that I've spent the best part of, since 2013, being involved in the food system, not just as an entrepreneur, but also working in government. And I think there's as much work to be done now as there ever has been, and I'd like to lean into some of that.
So watch this space. Don't go away just yet, because we thought we'd finished with a film about some of those citizen dialogues that Henry has been talking about. They're really interesting reflections from people who aren't leaders, thought leaders, politicians, but people who have got a genuine, deep interest in food. So thank you, Henry. Goodbye from us, and enjoy the film.
Food might initially seem quite a simple topic, but actually it's incredibly complex. It's bound up with people's emotions, it's bound up with their cultural attitudes.
The National Food Strategy is an independent review, which is a farm-to-fork look at the current food system and how we got to it.
What's really important to a national food strategy is that it takes the public with it.
Before the public dialogue, my initial expectations was very low.
Right at the start, I just attended thinking about the money that I'm getting out of it.
One of the advantages of public dialogue in comparison with other approaches is that they hear from experts, and it means that people are developing their views from an informed perspective.
By the end of it, they can make some powerful recommendations to policymakers.
Just maybe 6 merguez. Yeah, thank you.
It allows people to interact with each other, so they learn from each other. They start to act as citizens rather than individuals or consumers.
I was like a rabbit in headlights with all the information that I got, how farming works, the transportation of food.
The people that were running the meetings, they were listening to us. And this all of a sudden lit a spark in me, thinking this could make a difference.
One of the advantages of public dialogue in comparison with other approaches is that it allows you to get to the values that underlie their attitudes, but they are hard work. Policymakers who undertake these sorts of processes have to be committed to them.
It's a better way for making policy to involve those who are directly impacted by it.
COVID had quite a dramatic impact on this particular dialogue.
It was the first project that ScienceWise had taken online. We've become much more aware of the strengths of using multiple channels and multiple tools to engage people.
In the final session, the National Summit, participants got the chance to actually meet stakeholders in the system in order to agree together what the way forward was.
I'm hoping that the government will really go to the root of that report.
We're eating way too much meat as a country, and I feel like we could just reduce that. It will help so much.
It's more about sustainability. 10, 15 years ago would never have entered my head. Who cares? It's not my problem, but it is my problem.
It's okay saying each individual needs to change their ways, but government and supermarkets have a massive influence on that.
Something needs to change so that our expectations are different. I'm not saying lowered, but different.
How we get there, I don't have all the answers, but I love the fact that we're trying to find them.